Our final speaker for the Mrs. Seminar is Neville Kennard. Obviously with sponsoring Hopper's trip and convincing Hopper to come here for the first time. If we could have picked anyone in the world, we did, and we got what we wanted. When I first met Nev about a year and a half ago, he expressed, all these radical Rothbardian ideas and told me his history. And I said, well, why haven't you written anything about it? And I expect him to say because he didn't want to offend people or some such comment. Because you meet many people and they'll pretend they're radical, or in private they'll say something. But then, even if they've already established their business credentials or their career, they still, for whatever reason, I can't work it out, aren't interested in engaging with Rothbardian arguments. But Nev just said he hasn't written anything on it because no one will publish him. So I set up a website, and it's been 60 weeks, and for 60 consecutive weeks he's written a column defending his right to collude, his right not to vote, and other radical things. I've tried to get people to respond to Nev. We had a federal politician respond, only to say that he will not respond. So that was the closest. That was the closest we have got. And I guess one of our aims is from this event that it's another avenue in which people are invited to respond. And if they can't find anywhere to publish their attempts to grapple with Rothbardian ideas, they can send it to me, and I'll publish it just as prominently as I publish Nev's items. So please send in your criticisms or questions, and invite all your friends who are critical to do the same. We will answer any questions. We want debate. And without further ado, here's Nev Kennard.
As Benjamin said, when we met, it was at a dinner put on by Shaken and Stirred by Leone and Parnell. And the title of the talk I gave was what I'm delivering tonight. I've expanded and enhanced it a little bit, I hope. My Journey to Anarchy, because perhaps it's interesting in how I went from being a political and economic agnostic to become an anarcho-capitalist. The word anarchist is not a very good word because it says more about what you're not than what you are. It's a bit like the word atheist, but I don't. Perhaps Hans Hopper's private law society is a better expression, but for want of a better word, anarcho-capitalist seems to be what we've got. And particularly, anarchist, in its popular expression, is bloodshed, fires in the streets, chaos, and that's the popular expression. When you look it up in the dictionary, fundamentally it means without a ruler. And I sort of see that without a ruler, I see myself as being a peaceful, quiet, loving anarchist. I just don't want to have a ruler, that's all. What I've come to appreciate is that the concept of self-ownership, although I don't have it necessarily in all respects physically or financially, because I get invaded and robbed, I think there's also a point in which you can be have your self-ownership mentally, spiritually, and be whole. And I think by the journey that I've had over the last 30, 40 years has brought, I've been a slow learner, so it took me a long time to get there. What happened in the 1960s, And I found myself in business. I went into my father's business, I bought him out. I thought, well, maybe I better learn something about economics. I hadn't been to university. I scraped through the leaving certificate with 4 Bs. So I went into a bookshop and I saw a book in Demics. Down the spine was economics. I didn't know there were different sorts of economics. So I bought the book, hardcover, quite thick, took it home. I couldn't understand it. And I thought, gee, you've got to be smart to understand economics. It's terribly difficult. And so I put it down. I didn't get very far into it. I understand now why, because the book was written by Paul Samuelson. Then in 1970, my brother came back from America with a book by Harry Browne. Now, I think Ron Manners mentioned Harry Browne, and he was a significant force in the libertarian movement at that time. This book was entitled How You Can Profit from the Coming Devaluation, in which he correctly forecast, I think it was a 17% devaluation of the American dollar around about 70 or 71. But mixed in with his economic advice and predictions was a good dose of libertarian ideas. It just opened the door to me. I got another of his books, and in the back of that book was a bibliography. And I wrote away and got a heap of books. They were books by Rothbard, Mises, Hazlitt, Nock. They were the main ones that I just got into them. And you know, reading Mises, it's not like a nursery rhyme. But I understood it. It made sense. Samuelson made no sense. He had graphs and numbers and things, and whereas Mises and Rothbard, you know, for a new liberty, why I was introduced to the anarcho-capitalist idea by Rothbard at that time. And as I mentioned, for those who are here on the Workers' Party platform, I had no friends. I had no one to talk to. I had no one to share any ideas with, because if I opened my mouth with some of these thoughts, no one, they were either thought I was stupid, they were not interested. And the Workers' Party came along, and there I had a few fellow travellers. And as we mentioned then, it was you mentioned yesterday, when this was in the mid-70s, 75 was the Whitlam era, which was, I mean, if you think our present government is chaotic, Whitlam was about as bad as chaotic and unruly and as unpopular. So it was a very interesting, heady time in Australian politics and also in the economics, which were in a deep recession. Interest rates were high, things were looking pretty ordinary. Anyhow, the Workers' Party had this short, probably spectacular period, very short and very, I would say, a fairly inconspicuous failure politically, but it did coalesce the forces of the few libertarians that there were around at that time. So probably it was a significant force while being a political failure. And then in 1976, I got a note from one Greg Lindsay, who I'd heard of because of his Workers' Party connection, looking for support for the creation of an institute or some sort of body to propagate libertarian ideas. And I sent him a cheque. Greg was delighted. It was his first contribution, his first indication of support. So he kind of embraced me, and we became friends and colleagues in the creation of the Centre for Independent Studies. In fact, after a few months, he was getting nowhere. He was a high school teacher and trying to create this institution, the weekends and evenings. He said, I need some time, I've got to have full time. So I said, well, I'll give you a job. We put him on the payroll because donations were not tax deductible at that time. So to do it for the least expense, he became an employee of our company. Don't know what, job title was, but he got paid and we got the deduction. And you know, it was a very good time, because suddenly there were a few people coming out of the woodwork saying, hey, here's a new body, here's a new group. And at that time, we were sort of the lunatic fringe. The ideas were at that time quite radical, and it was quite fun being branded as interesting but impractical, or all sorts, but being somewhat rebellious, I suppose. And I think at that time the CIS was quite libertarian, which made the whole thing quite interesting and fun. As the CIS became more successful, and I use that, emphasise that word successful, it became less adventurous, and it became more devoted to fundraising, and it became more mainstream. And if I ever suggested something to Greg like, well, why don't we talk about drug law, drug prohibition? No, you know, more important things. He prioritised it, even though I thought the prohibition of drugs was not only fundamental to individual freedom, but also counterproductive in the use of drugs and the population of prisons and all that sort of thing, and of course the contamination and corruption of the police. So anyway, I also had hoped, and having, I mean, I did read Rothbard in about 1970 or 71, but I thought if we have less government, which was the CIS position, or no government, you know, doesn't matter that much as long as it goes in that direction. So I held out great hope that we would start seeing a diminution of government. And also, there were a few politicians starting to hang around. I thought, well, that's good. These blokes, you know, if they have some influence, we might actually start making some improvements. We might see a reduction in the size of government. One of those politicians was Bob Carr, who was then leader of the opposition in New South Wales. He became elected Premier, and I thought, wow, Bob was, and he was an intelligent guy, articulate. I thought, well, he's been around the CIS. He'll know a few things. He'll have some ideas. We'll see something happening here. Well, he got into office, became Premier, became a politician, and he just, I don't know what happens, whether it's the lure of office, the lure of the next election. It seemed that any will to reform, if he ever had any, evaporated, and he became a big spending politician, and he had a lucky run economically. Things were good. And so that sort of alerted me to the fact that, well, just because there's politicians hanging around doesn't mean it's going to make any difference if and when they get elected to office. And the other thing that moderated the CIS, no radical ideas were voiced, because the big end of town was on the board, and they were invited to nice parties, make big donations, and we didn't want to rock the funding base. It was a sort of a congregation, and if you're the minister with an affluent congregation, you don't bring in a radical preacher who's going to suggest, you know, let me talk to you about atheism. You know, the contributions in the plate when it goes around would just dry up. So there was a strategic method to this moderation that was going on. And the CIS was just becoming what I saw as more and more part of the ruling class, or the establishment. There's also I mean, I had suggested, mid-90s or something, look, why don't we in the CIO start a radical wing, a group of young, you can have a Chinese wall between, you can separate it, but have some radicals, because I could see there were a few young people, but hardly any young people coming along, being enlisted, being enthusiastic, like we've got here, all this youthful enthusiasm. That was not happening. But I thought, well, strategically it could be, the young Turks, the radical lunatics could be just separated a bit from the mainstream fundraising activities, and it could work. Well, that didn't happen. That was not accepted. I also had thought that what we needed, perhaps the big shift, perhaps the big change would happen if we had a financial crisis. We'd had some minor financial crises, but nothing very big. But if we had a major financial crisis, that might be the trigger for major reforms. Well, in 2007, 2008, we had that event. What happened? Exactly the reverse. Did government get reduced? Did taxes get reduced? No, it went totally the other way. I was going to say something here, actually, in connection with the idea of new ideas. There's an expression, management versus enterprise, and also the entrepreneurs versus the institution. Successful institutions really don't welcome entrepreneurs. They know how to do things. This, of course, creates opportunities for entrepreneurs to start other businesses or institutions, but the institution is a force against enterprise or against institution. As the CIS got more successful, the entrepreneurship or the innovative enterprise seemed to go away. Entrepreneurs are disruptive, and institutions and management, sometimes it's labelled entrepreneurs versus management. They're opposing forces. So it was about this time that I was introduced to the work of Professor Hans Hermann Hoppe. It was a review of a book that he had written or he had edited and compiled called The Myth of National Defence. And Professor Wolfgang Kasper, who Hans knows, edited this book, did a review in the CIS magazine, and I thought, well, that's pretty good. So I went away and got the book. Then I came to the Property and Freedom Society and further works of Hans, and I went along to a conference, I think it was 2007, of the Property and Freedom Society in Bodrum. I invited myself. It's by invitation. Hans doesn't want people he doesn't like there, so you have to be sort of invited. If you go along there with a bad attitude and a lot of money, he doesn't need you, thank you all the same. So anyhow, I invited myself. I dropped Wolfgang Kasper's name and he said, that's enough for me. And some of the scales were dropping off some of the delusion that the think tanks and changing government, changing the size of government. I then had two experiences with the hope of changing government. One was the Workers' Party, a political thing. The other was the think tank, trying to influence smaller government. So I'd sort of pretty much given up on that idea. And the people at Property and Freedom, their work were just stimulating, whereas I'd been to the Montpellier Society, and those classical liberals there, lovely people, do nice work in the area in which they operate, but it's practically devoid of ethics and morality. It's utilitarian. It's not to talk about ethics. It's this expression self-ownership, which I think, was that a Rothbardian expression? Yeah. you know, you don't hear that word, that we are sovereign individuals, responsible, capable and responsible for ourselves. In the establishment think tanks, you don't hear that. So that was where I came to know Hans. I came to have a pretty good appreciation for all the elements of a radical anarcho-capitalist attitude. One of the things that I enjoy doing is practicing strategically as much responsible civil disobedience as I can. I wrote one of the essays on economics.org, Civil Disobedience, the Rules of Engagement. And the essential element, I mean, there's two sort of sides to civil disobedience. One is just to do what you want to do with a minimum of confrontation. The other is to make a lot of noise. You know, wave banners and do things like that for the sake of getting arrested, for the sake of making your point. I don't want to do that. I just like to do a bit of civil disobedience if I think I can get away with it. And the main thing that I determined was there should be no victims. So if you build a house or add onto your house without council permission, if you employ someone for cash, you know, all these little things is what I call responsible civil disobedience. Jaywalking, I wrote an essay on jaywalking. Firstly, it's expedient to cross the street against the lights if you're not going to get hurt. And the other thing is not to disturb any drivers. Be a courteous jaywalker. You know, smile. Because people, you know, we're too compliant. We're too obedient. We do what we're told too much. You've got to be strategic because you don't want to go to jail for jaywalking or smoking a joint or whatever it is that you want. You've got to be strategic, careful. But I think we're terribly compliant. I've never had the opportunity to say it, but I'm waiting for the opportunity, is that when I want to do something, like put another room on the house or something like that, if I just do it and I get a knock on the door from a council officer, and he might say, you need a permission to do that. You need an approval. We're ready for the opportunity to say, no, I can do it without the approval. You need the approval. You're the one who needs to give me permission. I don't need it, thank you. I can do it without that. I don't know what sort of reaction I'd get, but I'm looking forward to the opportunity to say that. Now, one of the people that I've read is Henry David Thoreau. Many people here are familiar with Thoreau and his work. He lived in late 19th century Massachusetts, I think, and he was a sort of he would have been called a hippie, I suppose, then. But he did his little work. He liked nature, and he wrote one of his books was called On Civil Disobedience. But his edict was to be a good neighbour and a bad subject, and that's what I try to be. Thank you.